Welcome back, folks. My name's Shane. A few weeks ago I got back from Hawaii after shooting exclusively with the Panasonic GH5M2 using the 12 to 35mm f2.8 zoom lens. This is a really great combination for handheld work. It's nice and light. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of this camera. I'm also going to give you some tips and tricks to make the most out of the GH5M2, so hopefully you don't make the same mistakes that I made in a couple of different situations. I hope this video is helpful. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up. I'm going to timestamp everything in the description below just to let you know this video is not sponsored, and the reason the S5 is with me as well. I'll be talking a little bit about this in just a moment. Here we go. One of the things that shouldn't surprise anybody is the image quality. The image quality out of the GH5M2 is phenomenal. Sure, you're not going to get quite as much background separation with a lens that's f2.8 as the full frame counterparts and all that kind of stuff, but the straight up image quality, if you're not too concerned about getting lots of background separation, it really worked a treat. I got enough out of this in most situations to keep me satisfied, and that's always a good thing. The best footage, bar none, with this particular combination is outdoors on a bright sunny day or even an overcast day. The results look spectacular, the color science is great, everything about the image just looks beautiful. The second thing I really loved about the GH5M2 is it's compatible with my old Niwi, I'm not sure how you say that, but it's a battery grip that allows you to put in an extra battery. Now, when I first reviewed this a long time ago, I had a GH5 and a GH5S, and it was going to be my travel rig, but with this combination I got hours of battery life. And if you're using the new BLK22 batteries, you'll get even more battery life than you would just with a standard GH5 battery, so that's really cool. The best thing about the battery grip, and something I think I got wrong on my original review, is when this battery goes flat internally, it allows the camera to keep recording as long as you've got a battery in there. So you can just replace the flat one with another one and you're good to go. So I can highly recommend one of these. I'll link it down below. I'm a big fan of productivity, and my favorite profile on any of the Panasonic cameras is the natural profile. The great thing about the GH5M2, along with the S5, is the natural profile allows you to customize it to no end. So I just turned the sharpness down and it gave me a really great look. One of the biggest complaints with Micro Four Thirds with some cameras is that it can be overly sharp. That was my biggest complaint about the OMD EM1 Mark II. It just looked way too digital to my eye. The GH5M2 allows you to turn that sharpness down. And even set to standard, it's not as sharp as the Olympus cameras, which is great. It has more of an organic feel to it. So image quality, color science is great. It means I don't have to go ahead and do much more than pull the highlights down here, or maybe just add a little bit of saturation. You can customize this however you like. It's very flexible in terms of its picture profiles. The next major advantage to this particular setup is its IBIS. The IBIS in the GH5M2 is fantastic. If you don't know what that is, it's in-body image stabilization. It means you can get great handheld vlogging shots, either behind the camera, or if you're vlogging like this and walking with it, which we did plenty of, the results are just fantastic. And paired with this 12 to 35mm f2.8 lens, you get the Power OIS option, which is optical image stabilization. And paired with this camera body, the results were great. The GH5M2 also has a mode called IS Boost, which allows you just to hold it steady and it looks like it's on a tripod. It's hilarious to use, and it's a huge step up over any of my full frame cameras. If you're new to shooting, this particular IBIS system is a no-brainer, and it will make for a much more pleasing experience for your viewers, especially if you're posting online. One of the most important things to me is getting a sense of redundancy. If you plan on doing any type of paid work, or if you go away on a trip, the last thing you want is an SD card to fail, and it can happen. It's happened to me once, and it's an awful experience. So I went away using new SD cards. I tested them a few times and they were fine. This allows you to write to 2 SD cards at the same time and get that sense of redundancy. Now, I was recording for hours with this at a time with my girlfriend, and we shot in 4K 10-bit 60 frames per second all day with no overheating warnings, no file corruptions, everything was as it should be. The reliability of this camera is fantastic. It doesn't get overly hot in the hand, even when you shoot all day. I love that. There's no fans to make it heavier. It's just an absolute beast, and if you want that sense of redundancy, you've got it with that extra SD card slot. This next benefit just relates to the lens. Now, if you've ever looked into full frame cameras before, a 24-70 field of view is what a lot of people love. You get a nice wide shot and you can kind of punch in and get a nice tight shot. This covers everything, and look how small it is. So for a 24-70 equivalent to be this small, it's unheard of. A little while back, I bought the Sigma 24-70 for my Sony. I took it back the next day. It was just too big, too heavy, and I heard it had a lot of dust problems. But the benefit of it didn't outweigh this particular setup. So if I do need the zoom lens, I'm keeping micro four thirds because it's nice and small, compact. I get awesome stabilization. So again, this lens is definitely worth it. One of the things I should point out about the optical image stabilization that I didn't mention before, the more you walk with it, the better it seems to work. So after you take your initial few steps, it really starts to work out how it's moving, and it keeps it nice and stable. This lens is a no-brainer. If you missed my review, I'll link it up in the cards. One of the things I've raved about for years when it came to Panasonic is their audio preamps, and this camera is no exception. When I did my full review of this, I was blown away it could go down to -18 dB instead of the standard -12. And I was using this pack, the Saramonic Blink 500 Pro, the entirety of the trip, and it worked beautifully. This camera is also compatible with Panasonic's DMW XLR adapter, which can just slide onto the hot shoe, and it works with no extra cables. So it's got that going for it as well. But paired with this particular wireless microphone pack, the GH5M2 gave me some of the best audio I could expect, and I even used it to record guitar occasionally as well. The audio preamps didn't let me down once, and I love how secure the 3.5mm audio jack is. You plug in and it actually feels like it's going to stay there, unlike the Sony A7C. Yes, I've got one. The audio jack feels like a toy. Let's talk about the autofocus performance. Now, one of the best modes on this particular camera is One Area, or the new One Area Plus body detection mode. And it's kind of like a square that you set up, or a box, and anything in that box will get tracked. It's pretty cool, and it's far more reliable on the most part than face detection autofocus, which works in some situations and not in others. The best combination I found with the GH5M2 with this 12-35mm f2.8 zoom lens is to turn the responsiveness all the way down and turn the speed down -1. And that will stay more locked on. Of course, if someone's moving really quickly towards the camera, you might not want it as locked on. But for most of the stuff I've used with this particular combination, that worked the best. Face tracking can work, but if you're moving around a lot more, it's far less reliable than One Area mode. Before we get into some of our tips, I'm going to talk about some of the times where this particular camera kind of let me down a little bit, the first of which was in low light situations. Now, the settings make a massive difference to the low light performance. You shouldn't run the ISO in aperture priority mode, otherwise the images are going to be almost unusable. But I was quite pleasantly surprised how great the GH5M2 paired with this 12-35 lens was up until about sundown. I got what I would consider to be very usable images without having to add any type of noise reduction. That low light performance at sundown wouldn't have been as good as if I took the kit lens out on the Panasonic S5. So in those kind of situations, I can highly recommend taking a full frame camera. But just because this was our main camera and we had it with us all day, it worked beautifully, and I wouldn't recommend using it anywhere past about sundown. I did shoot a whole lot of low light footage in aperture priority mode, which I totally regret. Looking at what I would consider to be a great flippy screen on this camera, the images didn't look that noisy. I was using my eyeball test thinking, this looks pretty good. I'm really impressed. I got back, reviewed the footage, and realized it was just way more noisy than it looked on screen. So don't shoot in aperture priority mode. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. If you plan on shooting in low light, go for something like the Panasonic S5. It's a much more capable low light camera, roughly the same price. Piggybacking off that last point, we shot indoors in variable frame rate mode on the GH5M2 and on the S5, and the S5 left the GH5M2 for dead in exactly the same situation. We have a much bigger ISO range on the S5 thanks to that full frame sensor, has more dynamic range, and it just captures more light. Even with the kit lens, it was far better than the results with the GH5M2. Again, it came down to what I thought I was seeing on screen. It all looked good on the back, but when I reviewed it in editing, I had to add so much post-processing to the images to make it usable. Outdoors, this is fantastic. Indoors, when you're shooting in the variable frame rate modes other than 60 frames per second, it's completely unusable. This next point's a major one, and I'll tell you how to fix it as well. The auto exposure on this camera kind of goes crazy. You could be in frame, but if the lighting changes whatsoever, it will either ramp up the exposure and underexpose you, or it will do the opposite, and it's very unpredictable. This is something I haven't noticed with the camera because as I've used this outdoors, it never had that problem. It always worked well. Indoors in the studio situation like this, I always have it set to manual mode, which is how you should probably set the exposure on this if you're going to be using it in drastically different lighting conditions. A lot of the times when we were in these stores, for example, the lights would change from room to room, and depending on where I was standing would drastically change how the camera thought to expose the scene, sometimes almost ruining the scene. Thankfully, I was shooting in 10-bit and I was able to correct a lot of that, but this was maybe my biggest drawback of the GH5M2. Let's wrap this video up. I'm going to give you some tips and tricks on how to make the most out of the GH5M2, and I've also turned on my backlights here. I totally forgot to put them on before. So let's get into it. One of the great things about this camera is the custom function buttons. I always have the IS boost mode assigned to the trash icon button on the lower right-hand side of the camera under the wheel. And this is because if you're doing any type of walking, you can leave it on the regular dual IS. But if you want it locked off shot, you can tap the button even while recording and it will kick in IS boost. It's a really powerful feature and it gives you the look of the camera essentially being on a tripod. While the IS boost is an extremely powerful feature, there's also E-stabilization, which is electronic stabilization. Some people say don't use it whatsoever, but I found it really handy and I programmed that to the little button that's sitting on the inside of the grip here. You can turn it on and off at the touch of a button. You will see a prompt on screen letting you know to turn it on or off, and there is a slight crop, but that stabilization is even better again. If you're using IS boost and you're stationary, you won't need E-stabilization, but if you're walking, give it a shot and it may improve your results. Secondly, if you plan on shooting anything extremely important, set up the SD card slots to mirror, which means you'll need 2 SD card slots, but you'll be recording to both. This way, if one card fails or you get a file corruption, which has never happened on a GH camera ever for me, then at least you've got a sense of redundancy. Thirdly, if you plan on doing any type of vlogging or you just want a one and done lens, I can highly recommend this 12 to 35mm f2.8. It's a great lens and it also has the Power OIS on the side, which allows it to be even more stable in combination with the built-in IBIS system. While Panasonic do make faster zoom lenses for the system, they come at the expense of being just as heavy as full frame lenses. So if you want to keep the size down and you want a one and done lens, this combination's hard to beat. If you plan on shooting in low light situations, keep the ISO below 1300 with a lens like this. If you're using a faster lens, then you'll also be able to bring it down even further and get much cleaner results. So again, the faster the lens, the lower the ISO can sit and the cleaner the overall end look will be. One of the things that can really ruin a shot is automatic exposure compensation. Sometimes that's really handy and other times it isn't. If you're shooting outdoors, you won't necessarily notice it much, but with this camera, set the ISO manually. You can hit the ISO button on the top and set it that way. Just make sure you're in the M mode when it comes to shooting video. One of my favorite features of this camera is how customizable the picture profiles are. It really sets it apart from most other cameras on the market. By hitting the Q button on the back, it'll bring up the current picture profile that you're in. You can then go ahead and change the highlights, the shadows, the sharpness, the contrast, the saturation, everything in camera to get the look that you want. This saves you a whole lot of time in editing. As I've mentioned before on other videos, I'm a big fan of the natural profile. It looks great. Try portrait mode too, it's really underrated. Lastly, if you plan on shooting for a long period of time, get one of these newer battery grip things. They can also be attached to a tripod on the bottom. This one set me back about 49 Australian dollars. You can get them just about anywhere, but I'll link them down below if you're interested. This allows you to get a better purchase on the camera. It also gives you a little bit of additional stability. Now, I use this when we were shooting mostly all day. If I'm not using it, you can simply unscrew it using the lock on the back, and then there it is. And now you've just got the camera as it is, so it's really quick to install or to take off. Thanks for watching, folks. My name's Shane. I know a lot of people who watch the channel are a big fan of this camera. Just to let you know, as of right now, at least as of shooting this video, I'm not planning on buying the GH6. It's not the right camera for me. I much prefer the lighter, smaller form factor of the GH5M2. And when it comes to its media card slots, having two that are identical and just having a much lighter Micro Four Thirds camera makes a lot of sense. If I want a big heavy camera, I'm taking a full frame camera with a big ass lens. So that's how I'm kind of looking at this right now. This is just a great camera, and if you can live within its limitations of its low light performance, which I think it did pretty well up until sunset, then it's a fantastic camera. The full-size HDMI port makes it great for any type of studio work. I use a reference monitor every time I shoot inside here, and this will work in this situation without any problems. I've used it on a lot of videos right in this very room, but I don't plan on getting rid of this. But in terms of Micro Four Thirds cameras, this is now the only one that I've got. I couldn't be happier. This combination, it's total run and gun, whilst not sacrificing the quality. Thanks again, catch you soon. See ya.